It started on what should have been an ordinary summer afternoon at the family's lakeside home in Michigan. 73-year-old Edward Miller shuffled toward the dock, his body still frail from heart surgery. But in an instant, the world tilted. His grandson Josh smirked as he shoved him into the water. The splash was followed not by alarm, not by rushing footsteps to save him, but by laughter. From the shore, Edward's son Michael and daughter-in-law, Linda, stood motionless, their eyes cold, their mouths twisted into faint smirks, as if his struggle meant nothing, gasping for air. Edward fought against the weight of betrayal pressing, down harder than the water around him. Every heartbeat pounded with a single devastating truth: the family he had built, the people he had once sacrificed everything for, no longer saw him as a man to love, but as a burden to discard. When he finally dragged himself back onto the dock, trembling and soaked, the silence was deafening. There were no apologies, no outstretched hands, only the echo of Josh's cruel laughter still ringing in his ears. That was the moment Edward realized something inside him had broken. The father, the grandfather, the provider he had become invisible in his own home. But Edward Miller was not done. Quietly, he vowed that day would mark the beginning not of his end, but of his reckoning. Edward Miller closed the bathroom door behind him, his wet clothes clinging to his skin, the echo of his grandson's cruel laughter still rattling in his mind. The mirror on the wall reflected a man he barely recognized, hair plastered to his forehead, lips trembling, eyes hollow with a sorrow too deep for words. He pressed both hands against the sink, breathing hard. At 73, after a lifetime of building, sacrificing, and giving, he saw what he had become in the eyes of those he loved most: a nuisance, a liability, a man no longer worthy of respect. The realization cut deeper than the chill of the lake water. For years, Kada had convinced himself that the coldness he felt from his son Michael and daughter-in-law Linda was just stress, or the natural distance of adulthood. He told himself that his grandson Josh, despite his arrogance, was just a boy acting out. But that illusion had shattered the moment Josh pushed him into the water. Their silence, Michael's refusal to move, Linda's smirk was the confirmation he had been avoiding for years. As he changed into dry clothes, Edward's mind drifted back to memories that once warmed his heart. He remembered holding baby Michael in his arms at the hospital, promising silently that he would give him the life he never had. He remembered working double shifts at the factory, saving every spare dollar to send his son to college. He remembered how, after Michael and Linda became busy with their careers, he stepped in to raise Josh, picking him up from school, teaching him to fish, buying a second-hand guitar so the boy could learn music. Every moment of love and sacrifice seemed to mock him now, twisted into a cruel joke. Sitting at his desk, Edward pulled a worn leather journal from the drawer. His hand shook as he wrote the first line: "They will never get the chance to drown me again." It wasn't just about the lake, it was about the slow drowning he had endured for years. Suffocating under the weight of being dismissed, disrespected, and pushed aside. Edward wasn't a man of anger. He wasn't interested in screaming matches or revenge fueled by rage, but he was a man of resolve. And as the ink bled across the page, he made himself a promise. His silence would no longer mean surrender. It would mean strategy. That night, the house was unusually quiet. Linda busied herself in the kitchen, muttering about cleaning up his mess. Michael sat in the living room, eyes glued to the television, pretending nothing had happened. And Josh, still flushed with the thrill of cruelty, bragged on the phone to a friend, laughing about how the old man almost sank. Edward heard every word from his room. Each syllable carved itself into his memory, fueling the quiet fire. Now burning in his chest. In the stillness, Edward began to think differently. He looked around the house not as the home he had built with his late wife Margaret, but as a battlefield. The people under its roof weren't family anymore. They were opportunists, waiting for the day he would become too weak to resist. He imagined the conversations they'd been having behind his back, the plans to seize control of his accounts, his property, his decisions, but they had underestimated him. Edward Miller was old. Yes. His body had slowed, his hands had grown unsteady, and his heart had been through surgery. But his mind was sharp, his will unbroken. He would not allow himself to be erased from his own story. If his son and daughter-in-law thought of him as a burden, then so be it, but they would never control his life, nor dictate his ending. As he laid the journal on his nightstand, Edward whispered into the darkness, "I raised you to be better than this. If you choose greed over love, then I'll choose silence over weakness." And for the first time in years, Edward didn't feel defeated. He felt awake. The next morning, Edward Miller rose earlier than usual. The house was still, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He moved slowly, carefully, his body still sore from yesterday's ordeal at the lake. Yet inside there was something different, something steady. He no longer felt like a man waiting for kindness from people who had none to give. He was a man, preparing for battle. He sat at the small oak desk in his bedroom. It's the same desk where his late wife Margaret had once written grocery lists and love notes tucked into his lunchbox. Pulling the leather-bound journal toward him, Edward opened to the page he had begun the night before. The words stared back at him. "They will never get the chance to drown me again." This time, the ink flowed more smoothly from his pen. He wrote about the silence in the house after the lake incident, about Linda's muttering, Michael's indifference, and Josh's cruel laughter on the phone. He wrote not with despair, but with clarity. Every detail, every slight, every moment of betrayal all became evidence. This journal wasn't just for him. It was a record, a testament, a map of his awakening. "Silence is not weakness," he wrote. "It's a warning." Edward had spent a lifetime solving problems with patience. At the factory, where he had worked 35 years, he had survived layoffs, strikes, and accidents not by shouting the loudest, but by outlasting everyone else with quiet endurance. That patience had served him well. But now silence would serve another purpose. It would be his shield. He wouldn't give Michael, Linda, or Josh the satisfaction of knowing his plans. He would speak less, observe more, and prepare. Over breakfast, Linda placed a plate in front of him without meeting his eyes. Michael sipped his coffee, scrolling through his phone. Josh stumbled in late, grinning as though the world owed him something. None of them mentioned what had happened at the lake. To them, it was already buried, but Edward knew better. He decided then that every word spoken in this house would be weighed. Every look exchanged, every action taken, he would study them. Thought he was fading, too weak to notice, too old to resist. Let them think that. There was power in being underestimated. After breakfast, Edward walked out onto the porch. The lake shimmered under the morning sun, its surface calm and deceptively peaceful. He closed his eyes and inhaled the scent of pine drifting from the woods. For a moment, he imagined Margaret standing beside him, her hand warm in his. She had always been his compass, the one who believed in his quiet strength. "Don't let them take from you what you worked so hard for," she had once whispered during a particularly hard season. That memory steadied him now. He picked up the phone later that day and called an old friend, Frank Harris, a man he had known since high school. Frank was the kind of friend who showed up when others vanished. A retired veteran with a sharp mind and a stubborn streak, and Edward explained, in halting words, what had happened with Josh, the silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Then Frank said simply, "Ed, it's time you stopped letting them walk over you. Whatever you need, I'm here." It was the first time Edward felt truly seen in months. That night, he returned to his journal. He sketched 3 columns on the page. What they know, what they don't, what I want them to think. Under each heading, he began listing details, strategies, and small steps. He didn't need to move mountains overnight. He only needed to prepare. In the hallway outside his door, he heard Josh's careless laughter again. He heard Linda's sharp tone as she complained about bills. He heard Michael's silence, the silence of a man who had long since surrendered his backbone. But inside Edward's room, there was another kind of silence, the kind that holds power, the kind that waits, the kind that builds. And for the first time in years, Edward Miller did not feel like he was drowning. He felt like a man standing on solid ground, ready for whatever storm would come next. That evening, Edward Miller sat in his favorite chair by the window, a wool blanket draped across his knees. The lake outside gleamed under the moonlight, the same lake where his grandson Josh had laughed as he struggled for breath. But Edward wasn't looking at the water. His eyes were fixed on an old guitar, leaning in the corner of the room, its worn smooth, one string still missing, a relic of a time when love and family meant something different. His mind drifted back, unbidden, to the day he bought that guitar. Money had been tight, as it often was, but he had walked into a pawn shop downtown, fingers tracing over rows of instruments until he found the one with just enough character, just enough history to hand to a boy with bright eyes and endless questions. Josh had been 8 years old then, small and eager, his face lighting up when Edward placed the guitar in his hands. "This is yours," he had said, though it had meant giving up a week's worth of overtime pay. Edward remembered those nights vividly sitting on the porch, teaching Josh simple chords under the glow of the porch light Margaret would bring out lemonade, her smile soft, her laughter carrying across the yard. Back then, Josh adored his grandfather. He'd beg to sleep over, curl up in the guest room, and whisper about his dreams of being a musician. Edward had believed in him with all his heart, and it wasn't just the guitar. There were fishing trips on chilly autumn mornings, Edward's large hands steadying Josh's smaller ones as he cast his line. There were nights spent pacing the floor with the boy when he was sick, Edward humming lullabies long after midnight. There was the Christmas when Edward, despite bills piling up, bought Josh a bike because his parents had been too busy chasing promotions to notice their son's wish. Every memory was a thread Edward had woven into Josh's life, a tapestry of love and sacrifice. But now those threads felt frayed, unraveling with every cruel laugh, every shove, every smirk. The boy he had once cradled and nurtured had become someone unrecognizable. Shaped by greed and indifference rather than gratitude, Edward sighed, running a hand across his face. He knew that life changed people. He knew Michael and Linda's absence had carved something hollow into Josh's character, but it didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. It wasn't just that his grandson had pushed him into the lake. It was that the child he had once poured his heart into now found joy in his suffering. He whispered into the quiet room as though Margaret were still there, "Where did I go wrong?" But Margaret, steady and kind, even in memory, seemed to answer in the silence. "You did what you could." They chose their path. Edward leaned back in his chair, letting the memories wash over him. For a moment, the weight of them was almost unbearable. It would have been easy to collapse under the grief, to let it consume him. Yet even as tears pricked his eyes, he felt something else rising, something stronger. Those memories weren't chains. They were reminders. Reminders that he had given love freely, faithfully, without regret. That was who he was. That was his legacy, not the cruelty of a grandson, or the coldness of a son and daughter-in-law. Reaching for the journal once more, Edward wrote in large, deliberate letters, "I gave, and I gave, and I gave. They can take nothing from me that I did not already give freely. But from this day forward, I will give only to those who value it." He underlined the last sentence twice. The guitar in the corner no longer looked like a symbol of loss. It looked like a reminder of the man he still was, a man capable of love, but also capable of drawing boundaries. Edward closed the journal and exhaled slowly. The weight of memories remained, but now they were not just burdens. They were fuel. And as he drifted to sleep that night, Edward Miller knew one thing with certainty. The past would not drown him. It would anchor him as he prepared for what lay ahead. The next morning, Edward Miller sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, growing cold between his hands. The house was alive with distant sounds. Linda's clipped voice on a phone call, Michael's low murmur as he left for work, Josh's heavy footsteps pounding upstairs. On the surface, it looked like a normal day in the Miller household, but Edward knew better. He could feel it in the air, thick and unspoken. They were waiting for him to weaken, to surrender, to sign something that would give them control. He would not. After breakfast, Edward reached for the phone. His fingers hovered over the numbers, hesitant for a moment. Pride made it difficult to ask for help, especially at his age. But Margaret had always said even the strongest oak needs roots to hold it steady. Edward knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. The first call was to Frank Harris, his childhood friend. Frank had lived just a few miles down the road for decades, a man who carried himself with the quiet discipline of the Marine he once was. When Edward explained haltingly at first, then with growing strength what Josh had done at the lake, and how Michael and Linda had stood by, Frank didn't laugh it off or downplay it. He was silent for a long moment, then said firmly, "Ed, that wasn't a prank. That was cruelty. It won't stop there unless you put a stop to it. You've got me whatever you need." The second call was harder. Edward dialed the number of Thomas Green, a local attorney recommended by a neighbor years ago. Green was known for being both sharp and steady. It's the kind of man who balanced legal precision with a genuine concern for his clients. When Edward told him what had happened, the lawyer's voice remained calm, but his words carried weight. "Mr. Miller, you still have full control of your estate, correct? Bank accounts, property, medical directives?" Edward hesitated. "For now, then we need to make sure it stays that way," Green replied. "I've seen families tear each other apart over far less than what you've described. Come into my office this week. We'll go over everything: wills, trusts, power of attorney. I'll make sure no one can take from you what you're not willing to give." As Edward hung up the phone, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. The faint stirrings of strength, not the kind of strength he once had in his youth, lifting boxes at the factory or building a porch with his bare hands. This was quieter, steadier, like a flame burning low, but sure. That evening, he told Frank everything. They sat on Frank's porch, the crickets humming in the background, as Edward poured out years of silent suffering, the cold remarks, the dismissive glances, the creeping sense that his family was circling like vultures. Frank listened without interrupting, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp. When Edward finally stopped, Frank leaned forward. "You're not alone in this, Ed," he said. "They've mistaken your kindness for weakness. That's on them. But now you've got me, and you've got Green. We'll lock things down so tight they won't be able to lift a penny without your say-so. Let them think you're frail. You'll be 3 steps ahead." For the first time in a long while, Edward smiled. It wasn't wide, it wasn't carefree, but it was real. That night, back at his desk, he opened his journal again. Columns he had drawn: what they know, what they don't, what I want them to think. He added a new line at the bottom of the page. "What I have, allies." It felt good to write it, stronger even. The house was still full of cold shoulders and sharp tongues. Josh still strutted with arrogance, Linda still muttered about money, and Michael still avoided eye contact. But Edward no longer felt like a lone soldier in hostile territory. He had friends, he had protection, and most importantly, he had a plan. The battle for his dignity and freedom had begun not with shouting, not with fists, but with pen strokes, phone calls, the quiet power of preparation. And Edward Miller, underestimated by his own family, was ready. A few days later, Edward Miller noticed a shift in the air around town. It began with small glances neighbors, pausing a little longer when they saw him at the grocery store, whispers exchanged on the sidewalk, the faint stirrings of a story traveling faster than wildfire. He didn't have to ask what it was about. He knew. The video Josh, proud of his cruelty, had bragged to his friends about pushing his grandfather into the lake. One of those friends had filmed it on a cell phone and shared it online. By morning, the clip had swept through their small Michigan town, leaving a trail of shock and outrage. The sight of a frail old man flailing in the water while his grandson laughed was more than gossip, it was evidence. When Edward walked into the diner that week for his usual black coffee and eggs, the conversations around him softened to a hush. Caught words shoved him in. Laughing, just cruel. Before voices quieted, a waitress, her eyes wide with sympathy, refilled his cup without being asked. "You hang in there, Mr. Miller," she said softly. It wasn't pity he saw in her eyes, it was anger. By afternoon, the whispers grew louder. His neighbor, Mrs. Carter, who who had always waved politely from across the street but rarely lingered, walked right up to his porch. Her jaw was tight, her words trembling with indignation. "Why, Edward, I saw that video." "I can't believe Michael and Linda stood there letting it happen. I raised my kids to respect their elders, not humiliate them. You don't deserve this." For a moment, Edward didn't know how to respond. He had lived so long under the shadow of dismissal that kindness felt unfamiliar, almost startling. He nodded slowly, grateful, though words stuck in his throat. Later that evening, he received a knock at the door. It was a teenage girl from down the street, Kayla, no older than 16. She shifted nervously, clutching her phone before blurting, "Mr. Miller, I saw what Josh did. I posted something online." I said, "Strength isn't laughing while someone drowns. Strength is saving them." Edward's chest tightened. A child, a stranger, really had said more in one sentence than his own family had in years. He thanked her, his voice hoarse, and she smiled before hurrying away. That night, Edward sat at his desk, journal open. Under the line, "What I have. Allies," he added another. "The truth has a way of finding light." It was a strange sensation. For so long, his family had controlled the narrative painting him as frail, irrelevant, a burden. But now, the town had seen the truth with their own eyes. And once truth spread, it was impossible to reel back in. Michael avoided him more than usual, shoulders stiff whenever their eyes met. Linda's sharp tone grew sharper, her patience shorter, as if she knew the world was turning against them. And Josh? He walked around sulking, muttering about how people didn't get the joke. But Edward knew it wasn't a joke anymore. It was a stain on their name, one that wouldn't wash out easily. And while Edward hadn't planned it this way, he couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction of knowing others finally understood what he had endured in silence. The humiliation he once carried alone was now a weight his family had to bear in public. As the days passed, support came in unexpected ways. A bag of fresh apples left on his porch with a note for strength. "We're with you." A church member stopping by to invite him back to Sunday service, promising he wouldn't sit alone. A simple handshake from a neighbor who said, "We saw, we know." Edward wrote again that night, "They tried to drown me in silence. Now their own noise has exposed them." For the first time, he realized he wasn't as invisible as he thought. The town, in its quiet way, had become another set of allies, and Edward Miller, long dismissed within his own home, began to feel the steady of something he hadn't known in years, respect. It was a Thursday evening when the storm finally broke inside the Miller house. The day had been unusually tense, Linda snapping at the smallest things, Michael pacing the hallway, Josh slamming doors upstairs. Edward sensed it coming, the way a sailor senses rough waters long before the waves appear. He braced himself. "Sure. Enough." After dinner, Linda called everyone into the kitchen. The table was cleared. Save for a single folder, she sat down with a sharp thud. "We need to discuss the future," she said, her voice clipped, her eyes flicking toward Edward with that familiar mix of disdain and calculation. Michael sat beside her, silent but tense, his fingers drumming nervously against the wood. Leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, smirk barely hiding his irritation. Edward took the seat at the far end, his journal resting quietly in his lap beneath the table, like a secret weapon. Linda opened the folder, pulling out papers. "These are transfer documents. It's with your health, Edward. It only makes sense that Michael take over financial responsibilities, power of attorney, property rights, all of it. It's for your protection. You don't want to be confused or taken advantage of." Her words were coated in false sweetness, but the venom underneath was unmistakable. Edward didn't flinch. He let the silence stretch long enough to make them shift uncomfortably in their seats. Then, slowly, he leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, most calm. "You stood on the shore and watched. As your son shoved me into a lake," he said evenly, his eyes fixed on Linda. "You laughed. And now, days later, you sit here telling me you want to protect me? What you want is to strip me of everything I've built." Michael's face flushed, but he said nothing. Linda's jaw tightened. Josh snorted, muttering, "It was just a joke, Grandpa." Don't be so dramatic. Edward's gaze snapped to him, sharp and unwavering. A joke is when both people laugh, Josh. What you did was cruelty, and the whole town knows it. That landed like a stone in water. Josh's smirk faltered. Cheeks reddened. Even Michael looked away. Edward took a slow breath, then continued. I will not be signing your papers. Not today. Not ever. This house, this life, is not yours to claim. And I am not yours to manage. For a moment, the kitchen was filled with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator. The power of Edward's words, spoken without anger, but with unshakable certainty, cut deeper than shouting ever could. Linda recovered first, her voice sharp. You're being unreasonable. We're trying to help you. Edward shook his head. Help is love. Help is respect. Help is pulling a man from the water, not pushing him under. If you can't tell the difference, then you don't know the meaning of the word. Michael shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders slumping. For the first time, he looked less like an aggressor and more like a man caught in the wreckage of his own choices. But he still didn't speak. Edward pushed his chair back and stood, his movements steady, despite the ache in his joints. This conversation is over. You wanted to treat me like a burden? Fine. But here this sigh will not be erased. Not from this house. Not from my life. Not from the legacy I choose to leave behind. He turned, walking toward the doorway. Behind him, Linda sputtered. You can't just... But Edward didn't turn back. His silence now was more powerful than any argument. Upstairs. Later that night, he wrote in his journal, they revealed themselves at the kitchen table, and I revealed myself too. Not as a man broken, but as a man unbending. And as he closed the book, Edward realized that the true battle wasn't just about property or power. It was about dignity. And that was one thing he would never surrender. 2 days after the kitchen table confrontation, Edward Miller found himself wandering into the study that had once belonged to his late wife, Margaret. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, streaming through the lace curtains, and the faint scent of her lavender sachets lingered as if time itself had preserved her presence. Edward hadn't stepped into the room often since she passed. It was too raw, too full of herb, but something pulled him there now. He opened the drawer of Margaret's old oak desk and found what he hadn't realized he was searching for: a cream-colored envelope, his name written in her graceful cursive. His heart tightened as he traced the familiar loops of her handwriting. With trembling hands, he broke the seal. Asterisk inside was a letter. My dearest Edward, it began. If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to guide you. And I fear what I always suspected has come truth, that Michael and Linda will see you as something to manage, not someone to love. Please, don't let them take what we've built together. Don't let them erase you. Edward's throat closed as he read on. Margaret explained things he hadn't known: accounts she had kept separate, investments she had made quietly, and most surprising of all, a small piece of property deeded solely in his name. She had left instructions for him to contact an attorney in town, Thomas Green, the very man Edward had already reached out to with Frank's encouragement. It was as if Margaret had been guiding him even from beyond the grave. This house, this life belongs to you until the day you decide otherwise, she wrote. If they ever turn against you, promise me you'll protect yourself. You've given them enough. Don't give them your dignity too. If you need to walk away, do it with your head held high. I trust you to know when the time is right. Edward pressed the paper to his chest, his eyes wet. It was as though Margaret had seen the future, had known this betrayal would come. She had prepared him, quietly, lovingly, in her own way. And with this letter in his hands, Edward no longer felt like a man fighting alone. He felt like half of a team again, his wife's wisdom carrying him forward. Later that evening, he added to his journal, she knew, she always knew. And she has armed me with more than love, she's armed me with foresight. At dinner that night, when Linda placed a stack of bills beside his plate with a pointed look, Edward didn't shrink under the weight of her disapproval. He smiled, calm and steady, because he held something far stronger than fear. He held proof of a future his family knew nothing about, secret they could not touch. Josh rolled his eyes across the table, muttering under his breath, but Edward hardly noticed. Michael avoided eye contact, fiddling with his fork. Linda, sharp as ever, pressed again about the transfer papers. Her voice dipped in feigned concern. Edward let her finish before replying quietly. Margaret always said the truth has a way of showing itself. You may think you're protecting me, Linda, but the truth, you're protecting yourself, and I won't be a part of that. He rose from the table, leaving them stunned, the letter burning like a shield in his pocket. That night, Edward slept more soundly than he had in weeks. Margaret's words wrapped around him like a blanket, steady and reassuring. Her letter had changed everything. It wasn't just paper and ink, it was a reminder that he had someone on his side all along. Someone who had never underestimated him. Someone who had prepared the way forward. Asterisk for the first time since the lake incident. Edward didn't dream of drowning. He dreamed of standing tall on the shore, Margaret's hand resting gently in his, guiding him toward the next step. The following week, Edward Miller prepared for what he knew would be the breaking point. Margaret's letter sat safely tucked. Inside his journal, a hidden anchor that gave him strength. The whispers around town had only grown louder since the video surfaced, and now, even at church and the grocery store, people looked at him differently. Not with pity, but with a quiet respect. His family, however, had grown restless. Linda's sharpness had turned into outright hostility, her voice a constant blade in the house. Michael's silence had deepened, his guilt weighing heavy, though he lacked the courage to speak against his wife. And Josh, cocky, arrogant Josh, still carried himself like the world owed him something, though his swagger faltered more often now under the judgmental eyes of neighbors. It all came to a head one Saturday morning. Edward was in the living room, sipping coffee, when Michael and Linda walked in with their lawyer. The man, dressed in a crisp suit, carried yet another folder of documents. "Dad," Michael began, his tone tight, "we need to settle this today. The house, the finances, it's too much for you. It's time we take over. It's what Mom would have wanted." Edward's grip tightened around his mug at the mention of Margaret, but he didn't flinch. Slowly, he set the cup down and rose. To his feet. His joints ached, but his voice, when it came, was steady as stone. "Don't you dare speak for Margaret," he said firmly. "She knew who you were long before I did. She warned me. And she prepared me." Linda's face paled, then hardened. "This is ridiculous. You're confused, Edward. You're being manipulated." "Confused," Edward interrupted, his eyes blazing. "Was confused when I thought love meant loyalty. Was confused when I believed family meant protection. But I'm not confused anymore. I see you clearly, all of you." The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Michael and Linda, but Edward pressed on. He reached for his journal, flipping it open to a page he had prepared. His voice carried the weight of months of silence breaking at last. "I have documented everything," he said. "Every cruel word, every dismissal, every moment you tried to erase me. And now the town has seen the truth too. You think you can shame me into signing papers, but the shame isn't mine to carry anymore. It's yours." Josh, who had been leaning against the doorway with his usual smirk, scoffed. "Nobody cares about your stupid journal, Grandpa. You're just bitter." Edward turned to him, his gaze sharp. "People care, Josh. They care because decency still matters. Respect still matters. And one day, when you're older and weaker than you ever thought you'd be, you'll remember the moment. You laughed as I fought for air, and you'll realize you weren't just cruelly destroyed your own reflection." Josh's smirk faltered. For the first time, Edward saw uncertainty in his eyes. Linda snapped, "Enough of this. Can't keep living here like this. We won't allow it." Edward straightened, his shoulders squared despite his age. "You don't get to allow anything. This is my home, my life. And thanks to Margaret, thanks to my friends, thanks to the truth, I'm not yours to control. Not now, not ever." The lawyer cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should revisit this at another time." He gathered his papers quickly, clearly uncomfortable. Michael said nothing. He only stared at his father with a mixture of shame and Resignation, his eyes dropping, as if he finally understood what he had lost. As they left the room, Edward closed his journal, the sound sharp in the silence that followed. For the first time in months, the house felt lighter, not because his family had changed, but because he had. That night, he wrote his final words on the page. Today I stood, not as a burden, not as a victim, but as a man who refused to be erased. And as he set the pen down, Edward Miller knew that the storm had passed. He had faced them at last, not with fists or fury, but with truth, dignity, and the unshakable resolve of a man who still had his voice. The next morning, the house was unusually quiet. Edward Miller sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee, staring out the window at the lake. That lake had always been a place of peace for him, where he'd taken Margaret on summer picnics, where he taught Josh to fish, where sunsets painted the water gold. But now every ripple reminded him of the moment he'd been shoved beneath its surface. Gasping for breath as his own grandson laughed, Josh came down the stairs, earbuds in, eyes glued to his phone, as if nothing had happened. He didn't greet his grandfather. He didn't look up, just walked past, muttering under his breath about plans with friends. Edward's heart ached. He remembered another time, not so long ago, when that same boy would have rushed into the kitchen, excited to tell him about a good grade or two, ask if they could take the canoe out. What had changed? When had Josh's smile turned cold, his respect curdled into arrogance? Later that day, Linda returned from town. She placed a stack of envelopes on the counter, barely sparing Edward a glance. "Bills," she said curtly, as though he were the one responsible for paying them. Michael followed behind her, silent, his eyes fixed anywhere but his father's. It was their way. They didn't have to say much. The message was always the same. You're in the way. Edward excused himself and retreated to his room. There. He pulled out the worn leather journal Margaret had given him years ago. Its pages had held everything: his thoughts, his prayers, his grief after she passed. Now, it became the only place where his voice truly lived. He turned to a fresh page and began to write. They see me as weak. They see me as a burden. But they forget. I am the man who built this house with my own hands. I am the man who raised a son, buried a wife, and survived heartache they will never understand. I will not be erased by their cruelty. As the words flowed, Edward felt a quiet strength building inside him. Writing was no longer just reflection, it was preparation. Began to make lists. What they know, they don't. What I want them to think. Strategy was taking shape. That evening, he took a walk through town. Neighbors nodded to him politely, some with lingering glances. He wondered how many had heard whispers of what Josh had done, how many knew the truth. Yet the silence of others no longer stung the way it once did. Edward understood something now. Respect could not be begged or borrowed, it had to be reclaimed. Back home. As the sun dipped low, Edward sat once more by the lake. The water shimmered in the fading light, no longer mocking him, but reflecting. His resolve: he knew the battles ahead would not be easy. Michael and Linda were circling, growing bolder with their hints and their papers. Josh, blind with arrogance, still believed himself untouchable. But Edward had lived long enough to know that arrogance often trips over its own feet. He closed his eyes and whispered to Margaret, as he often did, I'm not done yet. Edward's story reminds us that dignity isn't something others give, it's something we carry within ourselves. No matter how others treat us, no matter how cruel the betrayal, we always have the choice to stand firm, to protect our worth, and to refuse to be erased. If you've ever faced a moment where someone underestimated you or tried to silence your voice, remember Edward. Remember that even in the quietest rooms, your strength can speak louder than their cruelty. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to stand your ground against unfair treatment? Share your story in the comments. I read every one of them. And if Edward's journey speaks to you, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more. Stories that honor resilience, dignity, and the power of never giving up.